Some of you may not have a chance to look at the PowerPoint slide, and I can't explain as much as I'd like to while we're actually going through the book. So this way you can stop the video, you can pause it to look up the quote, you can pause it to write down what's on the slide, all of that. And so this should be a lot easier. So going back a little bit, we're on our way to see Kurtz in the novel in part 2. And he says that going up the river was like traveling back into the earliest beginnings of the world. That would be paragraph 49. He's talking about the wild and the impenetrable forest. It's primitive. And so to some degree, this plays into the novel when it's talking about his psychological journey back into the heart of darkness. To some degree, the darkness is when people were living without civilization, and when you didn't have anything controlling you. And that's kind of what nature is representing at this point, and the jungle represents. So he says you lost your way. You thought of yourself bewitched in another existence. That this was like a whole nother world for him, and for people in general who went into Africa or had this experience. This is a psychological journey for Marlowe. For a moment there, he breaks back into what's known as the frame for the novel, which is where Marlowe is telling the story to the people on the ship. And he says something about, doing our monkey tricks, and that we all perform in our civilized lives. So this is what he's referring to. In our civilized lives, we behave this way, we do these tricks, we do the things that we do, and that's totally different from what we would do in the wild, in nature. And they say, try to be civil, Marlowe. It's difficult to be civil once you've been out into the darkness. So Marlowe with the natives, he has some funny feelings about them, some that we might not expect. For example, he says that the cannibals were fine fellows, and that he got along with them. He seemed to really like the cannibals. You see that he has these sort of odd feelings. He refers to the assistant as an improved specimen, and then compares him to a dog that walks on its hind legs and has pants on. And that's a very insulting way to put it, a dehumanizing way. And that's one of the criticisms of this novel, is that he dehumanizes the natives in the novel. He says that they were going deeper into the heart of darkness, so he's telling us that they're going into the psyche, into themselves, and into the heart of the uncivilization, the primitive. That it was monstrous and free. Why monstrous and free? So monstrous and free because it's scary for a civilized person to deal with their wild self and their uncivilized self, and that's a monstrous thing to be that free, because civilization is what kind of holds us into not doing the things that we otherwise might do. So part of the story here, they come upon a shack that has wood there. There's a note that says, "Wood for you, hurry up, approach cautiously." That's paragraph 55. And he realizes that they can't have that note there for there. It's not warning them about coming to that shack. It's warning them about what's going to come later. It's a foreshadowing. And then they hear these noises, screeches from the fog. It frightens them, but Marlowe says he doesn't think it's an impending attack. He says it's because they're afraid, and that they're desperate to get rid of the steamboat and the people on it. Manager calls Kurtz's man an intruder. This is a historical reference, that the Berlin Conference, the way that in the Berlin Conference, apparently the European countries divided Africa up. They didn't ask Africa, they just did it. They just said, these are our territories. And part of that imperialism, colonialism mindset, they just said, this is where we're going to go. And, like the Congo went to Belgium, for example. All right, so there was the screech in the woods. There was a loud howl, and the whites were upset by it, but the cannibals were interested, and the cannibal chief says he wants to eat them. this is where Marlowe goes into the whole thing about, well, I'm really surprised they hadn't eaten us. There were 30 of them. There were 5 of us. Why didn't they eat us too? And then he looked at the natives and said, or the pilgrims and said, oh, yeah, I see why. Those look disgusting. I wouldn't eat them either. So the payment that they were giving the natives was brass wire. They really couldn't use it. So he says, unless they swallowed the wire itself or made loops of it to snare the fishes with, I don't see what good that extravagant salary could be to them. You know, you have to wonder, really, is brass wire an extravagant salary? Is that good money? I don't know. They couldn't spend it on anything anyway, so it was useless to them, is what he was saying. He says that they couldn't weigh the consequences. They, with not much capacity to weigh the consequences. He's actually saying something rather insulting about the savages here, to say that they couldn't decide whether eating someone was a good idea or not. And that's you know, referring back to his ideas about civilization and you know, the English ideas about law, what's normal, what's good. And, you know, he's saying that the savages, the natives, can't do that. Probably a better way to put it, the Africans, not the natives or savages. They're savages according to him. The fog that was over around the boat, it's symbolic that they have a hard time understanding the savages, the natives. They have a hard time understanding, you know, what Kurtz is about. The fog represents this inability to see. They can't see. And of course, to see something also means to understand it. To you know, when we understand something, we say, "Oh, I see." And so an inability to see is also an inability to understand, which also could be related to the idea that, you know, psychologically he's not all there. He's having trouble. He says he didn't think that they would attack because the fog, this is Marlowe, didn't think they were going to attack because of the fog, because of the nature of the noise, that it sounded like grief. And that all he knew was that it was really an attempt to get rid of them. Now, he knows this because he knows what happens, and he's actually thinking forward in the novel. They do get attacked shortly, and they're shooting arrows at them and throwing at least one spear. And so he tells us that really they were just trying to get rid of us. They didn't want to kill us. They just wanted us to turn around and go away. So they attack right at the interstation. Right before the interstation, they get attacked. They're really not trying to kill them. The sailors, the people on the boat, the pilgrims and so forth, were shooting into the bush with their rifles. And the helmsman gets the rifle, the Martini Henry, that's what that was in the cabin. He gets it and fires, and then ends up getting speared and dies. And Marlowe, it's really weird, his reaction, because on one hand, he seems like he's really touched by, you know, what happened, the way that the helmsman looked at him. He throws his new shoes into the river, and he explains that as like part of his emotional, you know, reaction to the helmsman dying, that he had a kind of, what does he say? He had a kind of connection with him, a kinship, a bond that had developed, and he didn't realize it was there until after the helmsman was dead. So it's this weird thing where Marlowe almost seems to apologize for feeling emotional toward the natives, as if his listeners wouldn't understand why he would feel emotional about them dying. And he talks about how he thinks that he can't meet Kurtz now, and more importantly, he can't hear Kurtz. And he talks a lot about how hearing Kurtz is the important thing. Hearing what he has to say, hearing what he has to think, that his words are incandescent, I think he explains it. The role of women, they do have this comment at one point where he's talking about the women, and that the women have a beautiful world all of their own, and that we want to keep it that way. We want to make sure that they don't have to deal with the man's world. The question asked there, is it all related, all these layers of inequality? In other words, is the inequality for the women similar to the inequality for the natives? You know, obviously the natives are not being treated fairly. They're not equals. And, you know, neither are the women in this case. Has Kurtz become the master? My ivory, oh yes, I heard him. My intended, my ivory, my station, my river. He had taken a seat amongst the devils of the land. I mean it literally. Has Kurtz become a god? To the natives, I think we will see yes. He has become sort of a deity, a god. It's sort of what he was writing about when he talks about the writing the pamphlet. You know, Kurtz is the one that said that each station ought to be a way for people to help the natives, and that it ought to educate them and that sort of thing. And, you know, this is sort of what you would see a god doing, would be to help. And then this reminds us that earlier in the novel he had said that it's brutal to create countries and build nations. It's not very pretty to look at, but if you do it for a reason, if there's something behind it, then it's okay, he says. So to some degree, he also tells us that Kurtz presides over certain dances at midnight, that they would dance after doing rituals, unspeakable rituals, he says. And so this tells us that in fact, yeah, he has become a something that they worship, and he has a great deal of power with the natives. He starts out writing this report for the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs. He says in the report, we whites must necessarily appear to the savages as supernatural, and we exert a power for good practically unbounded. So he's talking about how the natives would see them as supernatural, as gods. And that's what he thinks. And then later on, in an unsteady hand, it says he wrote, exterminate all the brutes. We have to assume that he's saying you have to kill all the savages that won't be civilized. Although that's a very uncivilized approach, if you think about it. That's really representing a descent into madness, that you think, well, I can't deal with all these uncivilized people, these savages, so let's destroy them all. Then, as we see, we meet the Harlequin. He's Russian, and he tries to explain what's going on to Marlowe. He says that they are simple people. They don't mean harm, not exactly. They don't want him to go. You don't talk with that man. You listen to him. This man has enlarged my mind. Okay, so that's paragraphs 80 through 82. The Harlequin, he's, by the way, a Harlequin is a clown, right? It would be those guys that wear the colorful outfits. And he mentions that he has patches all over his suit, which is why he calls him a Harlequin. But a clown is what a Harlequin is. And I believe that this also kind of relates to this idea of Kurtz being a god, or maybe even a king to some degree. Because if you'll think about it, kings always had their jester, you know, that there was always a court jester. And in Shakespeare, for example, in King Lear, he has the fool, and the fool is the one who can get away with speaking the truth, because no one listens to a fool, no one takes a fool seriously. And so in King Lear, the fool plays a really useful, important role. And I think the Harlequin is sort of related to that. He plays this role of explaining to us the truth about Kurtz, and then in a way not the truth too, because we're in the darkness now. We're in the lack of civilization in the primitive world, where things don't always make sense, like Marlowe had said to us. It won't always make sense. And then we'll come to part 3. I'm going to go over part 3 more in the next video. Some of the classes are not quite up to this point, and I will make another video explaining further that I will also post. So hopefully this has been helpful. If you have questions, please post them in the comments, or also you could send me a Remind chat using the Remind app, or just write them down in your notes and bring them in, and we can talk about them at the beginning of classes as part of the bell work and the warm-up. So we're almost done with the book. Awesome.